Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the presentation of the quantitative results chapter. And just before we get into the presentation, I'd like to present some information in case you're interested in additional support or assistance outside of this webinar. So we do provide full service dissertation consulting and assistance. We help with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you do want to know more about us and are interested in additional help or services beyond what we provide in this webinar today, you can use this information to contact us and learn more about what kind of help we provide. And so first, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we are going to be covering today in terms of the quantitative results chapter. So first, we will discuss the purpose of the results chapter, and then we'll get into the different components of the results chapter. So we'll talk about the different sections and pieces that are typically included in the results chapter that you should have in your results chapter. And those may include the introduction, data collection and preparation, demographic information, assumptions testing, analysis of the research questions, and the summary. And then after we go through all the components of the chapter, we'll have time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. So if you do have any questions during the course of the presentation, you may type those into the question section, and any questions that aren't answered over the course of the presentation, we will have a chance to answer those during the question section at the end. And just as another note, this presentation is geared towards a quantitative results chapter. So today we'll just be focusing on what to include in the results chapter for a quantitative study, and we won't be talking about results chapters for qualitative or mixed method studies today. Okay, so first let's just briefly talk about what exactly the results chapter is and why the results chapter is important. So the purpose of the results chapter is to present the data and the analyses conducted to answer your research questions or hypotheses. So this is really, arguably the most important chapter of your dissertation because it contains the results that you're presenting that will actually answer the research questions and the research aims that you set out to answer at the beginning of your dissertation. And so in the results chapter, you will want to present the findings or the results of the analyses for each research question and hypothesis, along with a clear statement that answers each research question and hypothesis. So at the end of your results chapter, you should have a very clear declarative answer for every research question hypothesis that you created for your study. But you don't really want to go much farther than that. So the main purpose of the results chapter is to answer those research questions and hypotheses and to explain the analysis that allowed you to arrive at that answer. You don't really want to go into deeper interpretation of those results and what they mean, because that's what the discussion chapter is for. So you want to save further interpretation of the results for the discussion chapter and just focus on the answer to the research questions. And it's worth noting that we are going to be covering the sections that are most typical in a results chapter based on our experience working with a lot of different students in schools in terms of what schools most commonly require and what the general standards are for presenting the results chapter. But this is going to vary based on your school and your degree program, and sometimes even your specific committee members or reviewers will have specific guidelines for you to follow in terms of how you present your results. So these are really just a guide for what is typically found in the results chapter and how to present these things. but you really should refer to your specific school guidelines and requirements to know exactly what information needs to go in the results chapter, because that may be a little bit different from the information that we present. So now let's get into the actual kind of typical components of the results chapter. And this is starting with just a basic introduction, which you usually find at the beginning of every chapter in the dissertation. And the purpose of the introduction is really just to reorient the reader to the purpose of the study, restate the research questions and hypotheses, and outline what's going to be in the chapter. So you can start with a simple restatement of the purpose or the problem of the study. It doesn't have to be, a full statement of the purpose of the problem, like what you might have in chapter 1, but maybe just a sentence or two that summarizes the purpose of the study. You may also want to restate your research questions and hypotheses, and these should be stated verbatim exactly as they're presented in the previous chapters of the dissertation. Whenever you state your research questions and hypotheses, they should be stated the exact same way in the exact same format every single time you write them out in your dissertation. So that should be aligned with your previous chapters. And then you may just want to outline the contents of the results chapter. And this can really just be as simple as listing off all of the different sections that the results chapter will contain. It doesn't really have to be any more detailed or complicated than that usually. And then typically the next section after the introduction will talk a little bit about your data collection and preparation. So in this section, you want to summarize the data collection procedures that you conducted. And this should be pretty much exactly aligned with what you describe in your chapter 3. You don't have to restate all of the details about the data collection procedures from your chapter 3. You may want to kind of summarize that down into just a couple of sentences, but you do want to kind of reorient your reader to how exactly the data were collected, and more precisely what you actually did to collect the data in your study. Because once you get to the results chapter, the data collection has been completed. So you now know exactly what you did to collect all the data. Whereas when you're working on the methodology chapter, you're just proposing your plan for collecting the data. Now you're presenting the results after you've actually carried out your data collection. So it may be important to note in this section if there were any changes from your original plan versus what you actually did in your study. For any number of reasons, sometimes your data collection procedures or plan can change from your proposal stage to your actual data collection stage. You may run into issues, or you may have to make changes to your study that were unforeseen that might change how you collected the data. And so it's usually good to note any deviations or changes from what was in your proposal in this chapter so that readers know anything that may have changed from what was discussed in the previous chapters. And in addition to how the data were collected, you will want to discuss the response rate and attrition for your study. So for instance, some things that you might want to cover would be how many total responses did you receive? Did you have to remove or exclude responses? And if so, how many? And what was your criteria for excluding responses? You'll want to, after explaining all of the attrition in your study and how you excluded responses, what your final total sample size was after all of those exclusions. And then, if necessary, if your target sample size was not met for your study, so if you had a target sample size that you outlined in your proposal, and you did not meet that target at the end of your data collection, a lot of times reviewers will want you to include a post hoc power analysis so that you can report the statistical power of your study given that your target sample size was not met. And we won't go into the fine details of how to conduct the post hoc power analysis in this presentation because we do have other webinars that cover that topic. But just know that you may be asked to do a post hoc power analysis if you do not meet your target sample size. And then after talking about the response rate and the attrition, you may need to discuss any preliminary data preparation steps that you took in order to clean the data. So this may involve things like checking the data for accuracy, handling missing data, checking for outliers, or if you had to do any coding or recoding of your data or compute any scores for your variables, you may often discuss it in this section. And so now let's just take a look at a few examples of what information in this section might look like. And I just took these from excerpts from different results sections. So they aren't all inclusive, but they may give you an idea of how this type of information is written up and what types of information you need to include in these sections. So for instance, we see just a very brief example here where we talk about the total number of survey responses that we got for our study, what we did about participants who were missing responses, what our final total was, and then some information about what we did to treat the missing data in our study. And another note is I may go through some of these examples a little bit quickly, but don't worry if you're not able to catch everything in these examples because we do make the PowerPoint slides for the webinar available for you to look at a later time. So you are free to review those slides later at your convenience. And here's just another example that's a little bit more detailed where we talk a little bit more about the details of the data collection. Again, how many total participants we had. We go through the steps of excluding participants for various reasons. And we talk about how we handle missing data if there were any. And again, note the final sample size for our study. And then here is just a small example of a write-up for a post hoc power analysis if you are in the situation where you have to include a post hoc power analysis. So here we state that we conducted the post hoc power analysis. We state what was the statistical analysis, what our sample size was, and what the power was for that particular analysis. And you may have to do it for multiple analyses depending on if you have multiple types of analysis that you did for your study. So this is, again, just an example of what that write-up might look like. Now let's talk about the demographics and the descriptive statistics. So after you go over your data collection and establish your final sample size and how you arrived at that, next you typically describe your sample. So this can include demographic information on any demographic variables that you collected from your participants, and also descriptive statistics on the other variables of interest in your study. So things like your independent variables, your dependent variables, covariates, and other variables like that. So you want to present the descriptive statistics for all of your different variables of interest so that you can adequately describe your sample. And so these might include frequencies and percentages for categorical variables, so variables like gender and ethnicity. So you'd report the percentage of males and females in the sample, the percentages of participants of different ethnic backgrounds in your sample. And then for continuous variables, you may present statistics like the mean and the standard deviation. You may also be required to report other statistics like skewness and kurtosis, or the median, or the range, but typically for continuous variables, at the very least, you'd present the means and the standard deviations for those variables. And what we mean by continuous variables is anything that's actually just a continuous number. So for instance, someone's age in years, or maybe something like grade point average or GPA. And when you present this descriptive information, especially for the demographic characteristics, if possible, some schools will want you to compare the demographic characteristics of your sample to the population. So if you actually have information about the population characteristics, so for instance, for something like gender, if you know in the population roughly how many males and females there are, you can relate that back to what you found in your sample. So you can say that, if your sample was comparable to the population in terms of the number of males and females, or if your sample seemed to be quite different from the population in terms of the proportions of males and females. So in some cases, you will want to relate the characteristics of your sample back to the population. And then for applicable measures, so really any type of construct or factor that involves using multiple items or questions to measure a certain construct, you may need to present reliability coefficients for those variables. And this is typically done using Cronbach's alpha. And so that would typically go in the descriptive section. You'd present the reliability coefficients for the variables that it is applicable to. And so now let's just take a look at a couple of examples of how we might present the descriptives. And again, per APA, if you are doing both a narrative and tables for your descriptives, you do need narrative to explain each table. So this is something that's important for aligning to APA and in general academic writing, is that you don't just want to present a table with no explanation. If you present a table, you do need to have some narrative that explains the table. Granted, you don't want the narrative to be completely redundant with the table, so you shouldn't just repeat every single number that is in your table in the narrative, but the table does need to be described at least a little bit in the narrative. So we see here an example of just a basic demographic table showing a breakdown of different demographic characteristics, and we have a little bit of narrative explanation preceding the table that summarizes the information in the table. So that's just an example of how you can write up some demographic characteristics. And this is an example of a table for continuous variables. So what we saw before was a table with categorical variables. So we had frequencies and percentages. So in this table, we have the minimum, maximum, mean, and standard deviation, or things like age and some other variables. And I'm just presenting this table by itself, but to go on what I noted previously, for each table that you include in your results, you will want to include a little bit of narrative explanation of the table as well. But this table just kind of shows you how descriptive statistics for continuous variables may be presented. And then here we see an example of how you may report reliability coefficients, or Cronbach's alphas. So we see here we have a table that shows the Cronbach's alpha coefficients for some different variables in our study, and we have a little bit of narrative explanation, just talking about the Cronbach's alphas. We state that they all exceeded the cutoff for acceptable reliability, and explain that we computed composite scores for each of these variables. So again, just a short example of how you might present and write up the results for your Cronbach's alpha. Okay, so next let's talk about the assumptions testing. So we've gotten past describing the data collection and describing the sample, and now we're getting closer to talking about the actual statistical tests that we ran to answer our research questions. But before we get into the actual results and answers to the research questions, we have to talk about statistical assumptions testing. So most statistical analyses that you'll do, with some exceptions, will have certain statistical assumptions that you will need to test before you can properly interpret the analysis. And so typically you do want to include all of the details about your assumptions testing. Sometimes it can be in a dedicated section. Sometimes it can just be presented alongside the results. So again, this is something that you would want to double check with your specific school guidelines to see how exactly the results of the assumptions testing should be presented. But for the assumptions testing, generally you want to list all of the required assumptions tests for each analysis, and what the results of those assumptions tests were, and what you did to account for any violations. So for each analysis that you do, you'll have a certain number of assumptions that you'll need to test. So for instance, maybe for a t-test, you'll need to assess normality and homogeneity of variance, or check for outliers. And so for each assumption required for that analysis, you'll want to say how you tested that assumption. So for instance, if you're testing normality, maybe you're doing a Shapiro-Wilk test, maybe you're looking at a histogram or a QQ plot or some other visual method. Maybe you're looking at skewness and kurtosis values. So you want to say how you're testing that. You want to say what the result of the assumptions test was. So whatever test you're using, you will want to interpret the result of that test. So for instance, for normality, if you're using a Shapiro-Wilk test, you want to say, whether or not the Shapiro-Wilk test was significant and what that means. You want to make a clear statement of whether the assumption was met or not met. So again, you run something like a Shapiro-Wilk test for normality, you find that it is significant, and that would indicate that the data are different from normal. So you would then say that the normality assumption was not met in that case. Or if the Shapiro-Wilk test turned out to be not significant, that would indicate that the data are not different from normal, and so the assumption of normality would be met. And then if you do have violations of your assumptions or any assumptions that were not met, you should discuss the action taken to account for the violations of those assumptions. So, and that'll really vary depending on what assumption you're testing and what the appropriate methods are for accounting for violations of the assumptions. So for instance, for normality, you might do something like do a transformation to the data to make it normal. Or maybe you say that, because the assumptions were violated, you were going to conduct an alternative test that don't require those assumptions to be met. So for instance, switching your analysis to a non-parametric analysis where you don't need assumptions like normality and homogeneity of variance to be met. And so now let's just take a look at a couple of examples of what the discussion of the assumptions testing might look like. So here we just see an example of a test for normality using a normal PP plot of regression residuals. So we just say, how we're testing normality. We say it's by examination of a normal PP plot. We interpret that figure, so we say that there was no deviation from the normal line. So we are interpreting what we are seeing in the plot, and we make a determination of if the assumption is met or not. So we say, the assumption of normality was met, and then we obviously present the actual visual representation of that plot in a figure. So here's a short example of how you might describe some other assumptions testing. So things like multicollinearity. And we have an example here with outliers, and specifically an example where we found that the assumption wasn't met. So we see that in this case, we had an outlier in our data. We can see in the highlighted portion, we described that there was an outlier. We say what our criterion was for determining the outlier, and then we say what our course of action was for dealing with that outlier. So in this case, we just say that we excluded that particular observation from the analysis. So this is just, again, a very brief example of how you might write up some assumptions and how you might describe action taken to account for violations of the assumptions. And so once you describe all of your assumptions testing and kind of set up everything for your actual analysis, then we can actually get into the discussion of the analyses that you'll conduct to address your research questions. So you'll want to organize this section by research question or hypothesis. So you want it to kind of go in a logical order that aligns with how you presented your research questions and hypotheses in your previous chapters. So for instance, if you have 5 research questions, probably just want to present them in order from 1 to 5. You don't want to, like, for instance, start with research question 5 and then jump to research question 2 and then to research question 4. It's going to be very confusing for your reader if you organize it that way. So you want to follow a very logical order, and generally the easiest way to do this is to just organize the section in order by your research questions and hypotheses. And similar to the data collection section, you do want to note any changes from the originally proposed data analysis procedures from your proposal. You do want to align your data analysis procedures with your proposal as much as you can. So assuming that you didn't have to make any changes for any reason, your data analysis procedures that you actually follow in your results chapter should directly align with what you proposed in your methodology chapter. But sometimes, the study doesn't always work out the way you originally planned to conduct it, like we talked about before. Sometimes there can be issues with the data collection that forces you to change your plans. And so if you do have to make any changes specifically to the data analysis procedures from what you actually proposed in your proposal phase, then you will want to note and justify those changes in this section. And for each analysis, you want to clearly identify the variables that you are using in each analysis, in addition to stating what analysis you are doing in each case. So, depending on the specific language that is appropriate to your analysis, you will want to identify the independent and dependent variables, or the predictor and criterion variables if you're doing a regression type of analysis, identify covariates or control variables, and things like that. So you will want to make sure you clearly identify all of the variables that you are using in each analysis and how they're being handled in that analysis. And you'll want to present the results of that analysis, which includes reporting the appropriate statistics associated with each test that you're doing. So this can include P-values, if you're running any inferential tests, which if you're doing a quantitative study, generally you will be doing inferential tests, and those will involve reporting p-values. But you'll also want to report things like effect sizes and confidence intervals where appropriate. And you'll also want to report post-hoc testing if it applies to your particular analysis. So post-hoc testing would apply if you're doing some kind of omnibus test or analysis, like for instance, an ANOVA. And if the ANOVA is significant, then you may need to do post-hoc tests to determine the exact differences between the groups that you are seeing in your results. So an ANOVA would be an example of analysis where if it's significant, you may have to do a post-hoc test. And so you will want to report the results of those post-hoc tests if they apply to your analysis. And then finally, and very importantly, for each analysis, you want to include a clear statement that answers the research question or hypothesis correctly based on the result of the analysis. If you have your hypotheses written in null and alternative format, which is very common for quantitative dissertations, then you want to make a clear, simple statement that says if the null hypothesis was rejected or if the null hypothesis was not rejected based on the result of the analysis. If your hypotheses are not in null and alternative format, you just have a simple statement for the hypothesis and it's not stated in the null format, then it could be a simple statement that says if the hypothesis was supported or not supported. So that's a very important thing to include with the results of the analysis of the research questions, is this statement that clearly says if each hypothesis was supported or not. So now let's take a look at a couple of examples of write-ups for some various statistical tests. So we see here, for instance, a very simple write-up for an independent samples t-test. So we see here in our narrative, we say what test we're doing. We are identifying our independent and dependent variables. Then we say the results of the test and we present the appropriate statistics. So for instance, we present our t statistic along with the degrees of freedom in parentheses here. And this is a common way to present this statistic. So it would be the t with degrees of freedom in parentheses after the t, and then the t value, which is 1.96. We report our p-value for that t-test, which in this case is 0.052. And then if you can, report an effect size measure. In this case, we're reporting Cohen's d, which in this case is 0.55. And so this would be kind of a common set of statistics that you would include for reporting the results of a t-test and the common APA format for presenting these statistics. And then we state that the result of the t-test is not significant. So we do this based on our p-value. See, our p-value is greater than 0.05, which is the most common cutoff that we use for determining statistical significance. Our p-value is greater than 0.05. So we say that the result is not significant. There are no differences in the scores based on our independent variable gender. And importantly, we state our answer to our hypothesis. The null hypothesis was not rejected because we did not find a difference. And then we just have a table to summarize the descriptive statistics relevant to that t-test. So if we're doing an independent samples t-test, we're comparing the means between these groups of gender, and you might commonly report the means for each group in a table like this. And so that was an example of a t-test that was not significant. And so let's look at an example of a t-test that is significant. So again, we're saying what analysis we're doing. We're identifying our variables. we present the results of our test. This time it is significant. Our p-value is less than 0.05. It indicates that there are differences in our dependent variable based on our independent variable. We present those means in this table down here. We make a simple statement describing the differences in the means, and we make our statement about our hypothesis. In this case, the null hypothesis was rejected. Now let's look at a slightly different example. So we looked at t-test, now we can look at an ANOVA. And the ANOVA results are going to be similar to the t-test. Again, we identify our test and our variables. We present the results of the ANOVA. In this case, instead of presenting the t, the ANOVA is based on the f-test. And whenever you have an f-test, you actually have two different values for the degrees of freedom. We have the numerator degrees of freedom, which come first, and then the error degrees of freedom, which come second. So whenever you see an f-test, there will always be two numbers in these parentheses. And that's followed by our f-value and our p-value. And in this case, our p-value is greater than 0.05, so we don't have significant differences. And again, our statement relating to our hypothesis, our null hypothesis was not rejected. And again, we present relevant descriptives that break down the means for the groups that we're comparing in this ANOVA. And now let's look at an example for a simple Pearson correlation. So again, we have some explanation for our analysis, and then we present results for our Pearson correlation. And for a Pearson correlation, you want to present your correlation coefficient, which is R, and the p-value for that correlation coefficient. So we're actually seeing here significant correlation coefficients. And so our null hypothesis is rejected, and we make that statement down here. And we may also have a table, which we see part of this table here, that presents the results of the correlation coefficients. And another thing to note about these statistics, which it may be a little bit difficult to see just in the presentation, but whenever you see a statistical abbreviation, such as like the letter R for the Pearson correlation or the letter P for the p-value or significance level, you want those abbreviations to be italicized. So basically almost all statistical abbreviations, with the exception of Greek letters, should be in italics. So that's just another kind of APA formatting issue to keep in mind when you're writing up your results. And now let's look at the results of another type of analysis. So let's look at the results for a regression. And so for a regression, you would typically present the results for the overall regression, which would come in the form of an f-test, which we already saw when we discussed ANOVA. So again, you'd have your f, the degrees of freedom, the f-value, our p-value associated with the overall test. In this case, it's less than 0.05, so the overall regression is significant. And then a measure of effect size that we have for the regression is our R squared, which is the percentage of variance explained. And we have a brief statement here that kind of interprets that R squared and says, we're explaining 19% of the variance with our regression model. Again, we have a clear statement relating to our hypothesis. Our null hypothesis is rejected. And then for regression, it's common to present a table showing all of the individual regression coefficient results. This is especially important if you have specific hypotheses about the individual predictors in your regression. It's still important to keep or to present this information even if your hypothesis has to do with the significance of the overall regression model and not necessarily the significance of the individual predictors. But it is useful to know this information about the individual predictors in the regression model either way. And then we just have a table showing these individual regression results, and we have some narrative explaining what's in the table. So we explain some of the significant predictors in the table. In this case, sex is a significant predictor with a significance or p-value less than 0.001. And we just have some narrative interpretation to explain that significant predictor. And so that just kind of went over what you need to present in terms of the write-up for your findings in relation to each analysis and research question. And then after you have answered each of your research question and hypotheses and presented all of your analyses, it's typical to end the results chapter with a summary. And so the summary can, depending on what your school wants in the summary, it can summarize all of the contents of the chapter or just be a summary of the answers to your research questions and hypotheses. So you'll want to restate the answer for each research question and hypothesis. Again, you may want to restate whether each null hypothesis was rejected or not rejected, or whether each hypothesis was supported or not supported. And then at the end, provide a very brief transitioning statement to the discussion chapter. And this can really just be 1 or 2 sentences saying something like, the next chapter will present an interpretation of these findings and a discussion of directions for future research. And that's really all you need for your summary. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So we covered all of the different components of the results chapter and how you can present those components. And again, we do provide full service dissertation consulting. So if you are interested in additional support or help or information, or more one-on-one help outside of this webinar, you can use this information to contact us and get more information about the different services that we provide. And so with that, we have reached the end of the presentations, so we'll now open things up to questions. So if anybody does have any questions we didn't answer over the course of the presentation, you may go ahead and use the question section to type in those questions now. And I'm just going to take a look here and see if we have any questions entered yet. Okay, so we do have one question here. How about doing power analysis prior to data collection to make sure about the required sample size instead of doing the post-hoc power analysis? Yeah, this is a good question, and typically you will be required in your proposal phase to do the power analysis to calculate your target sample size. So that is typical, but that falls more under the methodology phase of the study rather than the results phase, because in the methodology phase, you're proposing an analysis and you might do that power analysis to determine the sample size that you need. The post hoc power analysis comes into play when you conduct your study and, for whatever reason, you come up short on your target sample size. So for instance, maybe you're doing a t-test and your power analysis tells you you need 128 participants, but you only got 100 participants. So this is when you may be required to do a post hoc power analysis to show what your actual power was in your study based on the sample size that you obtain. But yeah, that's a really good point, that if you're in the proposal phase, if you're not past your data collection yet, and you're still in the process of proposing your study, you will want to do that power analysis, the a priori version of the power analysis, to determine the appropriate sample size for your study. And let's see, our next question is, do you have to address the assumptions even though they have been met, or is it only if they were not met? So this is a good question. You do want to list out all of the assumptions that are required for each analysis and state whether they are met or not met. So if the assumptions are met, then there's nothing extra that you have to do. You can just go right on to your proposed analysis and conduct it as planned. So in that sense, you don't need further discussion if those assumptions are met, but you do want to make sure that you have a discussion before you interpret your results about each assumption and whether it was met or not, just so that your readers know you tested those assumptions and what the results of those tests were. But if you do end up meeting all the assumptions, then there's nothing you really have to do with the assumptions after that. You can just say, how you tested it, what the result of that test was, state whether the assumption was met or not. And if all of them are met, you don't have to do anything else. All right, our next question is regarding the Pearson's R. Should you explain it in each research question? So I'm not sure if you mean if you should explain the rationale or the justification for the analysis in each research question. But generally for each research question, what you should be doing is identifying the analysis that you're doing for the question, and identifying the variables that you are using for each question. So with the Pearson's R, you would say that, in order to answer this research question, I'm conducting a Pearson correlation. These are the two variables that I'm correlating in this analysis. And then you go on to describe the results of your analysis. That being said, you may, if you have like a long list of research questions and you are using the same analysis to answer a lot of those research questions. So for instance, maybe you have 5 research questions and you're answering each one of those with a Pearson correlation, and you're just looking at a different pair of variables each time. You may be able to just summarize that in your results section by saying, in order to answer research questions 1 through 5, a series of Pearson correlations should or were conducted, and then you can identify the variables that you used in each Pearson correlation. So in that sense, you can kind of condense your explanation of the analysis down a little bit and not have to repeat things for each research question if you do have some repetitiveness to your analysis. But generally, for each analysis, you want to make sure you identify what you're doing and what variables you're using. Okay, let's move on to another question here. If I have only one factor, should I still examine reliability and validity for it? So this will kind of depend on what exactly that factor is and what you're doing with it. So for reliability, even if you only have like one variable in your study that you can measure reliability for, like one construct where reliability applies, you may still need to report the Cronbach's alpha that you get for that variable for your study. Validity is a little bit of a different issue. Often you may not be required to report validity if you're using or do tests for validity if you're using an instrument that's already been established in the literature. However, maybe you're doing a study where you are creating an instrument or you made some modifications to an instrument that may warrant a test of validity on your data. And in that case, you would have to, in your results section, explain how you tested validity and what the results of the validity tests were. So it really just kind of depends on your study, the variables that you're using, and what your school requires in terms of reporting reliability and validity. Because sometimes, especially if you're using an instrument that's already well established and validated, a lot of times doing your own tests for validity will not be necessary. Okay, so now another question is about assumptions. ANOVA was performed and Mauchly's sphericity was obtained and assumptions were violated. Not sure what results to report. So specifically for this, it sounds like you're talking about a repeated measures ANOVA, which is the type of analysis where you would test for sphericity using Mauchly's test. And if Mauchly's test is significant, so if the assumption of sphericity is violated, then there's actually a very simple way to address that violation, and that is to use a correction to the test that accounts for the violation of sphericity, and that's typically included in the output in stats programs like SPSS when you run the analysis. So if you're running a repeated measures ANOVA in SPSS, in your output, it will present results of the ANOVA based on different corrections to the test. It will, for instance, present a result with no correction, where it just may be called in the SPSS output sphericity assumed or no correction. But there will be other corrections reported for the results as well. So for instance, like Greenhouse Geiser and Huynh-Felt corrections. And so if you have a violation of sphericity determined by Mauchly's test, then typically the course of action to address that is to just report one of the results of the ANOVA based on the corrected tests. So typically you would report the results of the Greenhouse Geiser version of the test in order to account for that violation. Okay. It looks like those are all the open questions that we had. So if anyone has any additional questions, may have time for one or two more before we end the presentation. So I'll give another minute or so for more questions. Okay, so another question is, should I mention all the significant correlations, even some of them are not included in my hypotheses? So generally, you, in your section where you talk about the analysis of your research questions and hypotheses, you will want to stick with just discussing the results that are relevant to each research question and hypothesis. So in that particular section, you wouldn't really want to kind of go off and start talking about significant correlations with other variables that might not be relevant to answering the research question. That being said, some schools or guidelines may require you to present earlier in your results chapter, more with the descriptive statistics information, something like a correlation matrix, which shows all of the pairwise correlations with all of the variables in your study. So if you are required to present something like a correlation matrix, that might be the place where you can discuss any significant correlations that aren't necessarily tied to your research questions. But in the specific section where you go through each research question and describe the analysis for that research question, I don't think it's really necessary to go into all the different significant correlations if they aren't really relevant to answering that question. Okay. Again, I'll give maybe one more minute in case anybody else has any additional questions. So if you do have any last minute questions, go ahead and type those in now. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in, so I'll go ahead and end our presentation there. Again, thanks everyone for attending today. I hope everyone found this presentation useful. And again, if you are interested in additional help, you can use the information you see here to contact us, or you can look out for our other webinars. We do offer other webinars on different topics related to the dissertation. So you can feel free to browse other webinars that we have on upcoming topics if you're interested in any of those. But again, thanks everyone for attending today, and I hope everyone has a great day.